Just in case you're wondering, friends, that little announcement is to tell you that for the first time, we are recording a speaker so that those of you who want to share this and SAFE members who are not with us can hear this presentation. My apologies. I just wanted you to know what that was all about.
No, thanks for the clarification. Ms. Cohen's presentation is on Fossil Fuel Divestment 101, what it means, why we need it, and how to get involved. Ms. Cohen.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to preface this by just apologizing if things get a little choppy. Unfortunately, Wi-Fi is out across campus, so things have been a little in flux over the last few days. But I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm super excited to leave some time for Q&A and have some more engaged conversation about what divestment means and how you individually might want to get more involved with the cause. Is it possible to pull up the slides?
Absolutely. I will do that right now.
Thank you.
And I'll put you in present mode.
Okay, awesome. We can go forward to the first slide. Cool. So you've heard a little bit about me, but I just want to give you some more context on sort of the state of the Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard campaign, because I think it's really valuable for understanding more broadly where the movement's at right now. In 2012, a bunch of people, kids, mostly young folks, who were really, really frustrated with a system that clearly wasn't working in their favor when it came to advancing the prospects of the futures, started divestment campaigns in hopes of basically breaking down the political power of the fossil fuel industry. Which was this very clear, big obstacle to getting climate policy passed. In the years since, as has been mentioned, there's been numerous generations of fossil fuel divestment activists, which is thrilling to see. But I think the most remarkable feature of where a lot of divestment campaigns are today is a focus on reinvestment as well as divestment. So really critically examining how in-depth pension funds, a pot of money that could be divested from the fossil fuel industry can also be reinvested in just and sustainable industries that can actively support our futures, as opposed to just having the negative criterion of furthering their vision. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the climate science because you're all here. So I believe that you already know that we're in a climate crisis and it's killing tons of people around the world. I mean, Hurricane Ida is just like the most recent example of the kinds of very terrifying extreme weather events that have become the new normal. Also on a day-to-day basis, the mere pollution of the fossil fuel industry, its intentional siting in poor communities and communities of color is putting innumerable lives and livelihoods on the line. So even though we often talk about climate change as an existential threat and one that really, you know, puts future generations and young people's futures like mine on the hook, it's ultimately a day-to-day reality for a lot of people in the country and world. And the harms are already devastating to an extent that's truly unprecedented. We can keep going. And as alluded to, also a serious issue of justice. You know, what unites a lot of divestment activists today is the understanding that it's not just broader climate change, which is being, of course, driven by fossil fuels, but also the specific behavior of the fossil fuel industry that is seriously magnifying and exacerbating so many structural inequalities and injustices. You can see on the slide just a few findings of this fossil fuel racism report by Greenpeace USA. I highly recommend looking through it, but it pretty comprehensively breaks down how fossil fuel companies, for various reasons, systematically cite their infrastructure in the communities who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis, most vulnerable to the pollution, and of course, have the fewest political resources with which to fight back. This is just like a really startling statistic, I think, the one on my left about how responsible companies are for the current levels of global emissions, which again just speaks to how, you know, while it is important to think about personal sustainability, there's ultimately this larger system of work that is seriously being driven by the fossil fuel industry. And unless we have the ability to cap this focus on fossil fuel production that is continuing, we're not going to be able to limit levels of planetary warming or the injustices that they drive in any sort of meaningful way on a real timeline. Can you keep going? Yeah, and I think it's also to keep in mind that no fossil fuel company is currently aligned with the Paris Agreement, right? So like, why focus on fossil fuel companies when it comes to divestment? Divestment is a big word. It's tactics that's been around for a long time, since the fight against apartheid South Africa decades ago. But the reality is that, you know, fossil fuel companies are pernicious actors. They're not just sort of like, you know, contributing global greenhouse gas emissions without an understanding of what they're doing, right? And that goes back to the systematic citing of infrastructure in communities least able to fight back. On top of that, we see companies like ExxonMobil continuing to fund climate denial groups, to spread misinformation, to lobby against climate policy, particularly in the era of the Biden administration, when it seems like there's some more potential to really move big vision forward. And so there's barrier getting to where we need to be when it comes to tackling the climate crisis and injustice. Awesome. Okay, this is where I'm going to slow down a bit. So what is divestment, and like why this topic over any other when it comes to battling the industry at the heart of the climate crisis and climate injustice? Divestment is a really simple concept, but it's also kind of a scary word to throw around in day-to-day language, at least I found. It's the opposite of investment, right? So instead of putting money in the industry, deliberately take money out of that industry, usually because there's a clear moral imperative to do so. And the intended effect of divestment can be economic, but really what it is, and particularly in this context, is a political and a social effect. By moving money, particularly when you're moving the money of big, powerful, known nations out of fossil fuel industry, what we're doing is sending a clear signal to broader society that is fundamentally unjustifiable to be complicit in continuing the model of business that the fossil fuel industry embodies, right? We're saying that we are not going to give a social companies whose primary business models are the extraction and production of fossil fuels, which we know are driving the climate crisis and climate injustice. So morals and society stigmatization, that's the ultimate goal. And the effect of that, right, is to reduce the political power of these companies and this industry. Because if they become social pariahs, it's going to be a lot harder for, you know, it to be okay for a lawmaker, per se, to take money from these industries, to work with these industries, you know, to make claims that they can be part of an energy transition while they're so clearly resisting it. Can you go to the next slide? And the great thing about divestment as a tactic is that it is so universally applicable. Basically anywhere you can find a pot of money, right? Whether it's the bank that you go to, or your pension fund, or the endowment of your alma mater, you can divest that pot of money, and to that effect, you can also sustainably and justly reuse it, right? That's the sort of critical complement to divestment, is thinking about how these big funds that are sort of in the background of our everyday lives can actually be proxies for scaling up the alternative world we want to see, right? One that is fossil fuel free, that is climate injustice free, that is proactively equitable and sustainable. You can go to the next one. So this slide just sort of breaks down the main reasons for divestment. I think the moral imperative is the most obvious one, right? It seems sort of absurd, really, particularly at this point in time when the harms of the fossil fuel industry are so well documented. Industry's behavior in trying to prevent climate policy is so egregious. It's absurd to be investing in these companies. But there's also the financial imperative, right? Which is the reality that fossil fuels are not a good investment in a decarbonizing economy. And certainly we're not putting forward legislation that is going to help us decarbonize on the time we need right now. But it is an increasing reality, right? That climate change is a political issue, that lawmakers are acting on it, and that either way, renewables are going up as an industry, and fossil fuels are simply not the place to make your financial bet. So are cases in which divestment has happened really because of financial reasons? I would say that is still a reflection of the success of the morally grounded divestment movement and the work it's done in the years prior. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are just simply seeing the writing on the walls when it comes to fossil fuel investments. And then of course, there's the efficacy of divestment, right? Like already divestment has diminished public standing of the fossil fuel industry and made a dent on its political power, right? There are over 14.5 trillion worth of funds now committed to fossil fuel divestment worldwide. We've seen major asset managers recognizing the financial benefits of divestment when they wouldn't even mention the word years ago. And even fossil fuel companies themselves, like Shell, have recognized divestment as a material risk to their business model. So, pension fund divestment, no, we got a lot of pensioners here. There's some super great examples of this. I just put on a few US examples to this slide, right? So like New York City pension funds, New York State pension funds, University of California pension funds, which is just public university divestment commitment. I think now in 2 years. And they also divested their endowment at that time. So they divested a total of about over $80 billion, I think. I have to double check that, but yeah, it's pretty amazing. But I mean, these are just the US examples. There are so many more pension funds also that are smaller that haven't gotten much attention, still been so impactful. And also pension funds really around the world. There are a lot of other countries where the number of pension funds that have divested or are in the process of divesting or trying to divest is also much greater. There are a lot of examples you can find in Australia. And I have a resource at the end of these slides, which I know will be sent around, where you can actually look up all of the pension fund commitments. And you might actually want to connect with folks from groups that have successfully divested their pension funds. Next slide. Cool. So when getting involved in the divestment campaign, there are a lot of important questions to ask yourself. I think that, divestment at this point is a much more well-known tactic again than it was when these campaigns really first got started in 2012, which can work to your advantage at a lot of institutions. But ultimately, the tactics you want to bear will look very different based on the responsiveness of the institution you might target for divestment. So Harvard is a pretty intransigent institution. As a result of that, we are a very out there campaign in terms of the tactics that we adopt. Earlier this year, we filed a legal complaint against the university. Our biggest direct action so far was storming the football field of the 2019 Harvard-Yale game, which was a pretty historic divestment action. That sort of level of bombacity and public visibility really helps galvanize folks across men, and also scares institutions more broadly into recognizing the need to divest. But those aren't the right tactics for every sort of campaign. There are places where managers, especially at this point in time, may very seriously recognize the imperative for divestment, whether they're recognizing it on moral grounds or on financial grounds. And those are folks that you might want to think more critically about how you can build deeper relations with, how you can find sorts of internal channels of influence with, and have a serious sit-down conversation about divestment. If you find that's not possible, then there's a whole other world of tactics also that you might want to employ, right? It's all about thinking about the levers of influence you have, the things you want to divest, and how you can best utilize them in order to get a shift in institutional decision making on the issue. The next one. So I mentioned this really briefly, but I do think it's worth highlighting. Earlier this year, and at the end of last year, actually, a number of student divestment campaigns, including Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard, filed legal complaints with their state's attorney general or relevant financial or governmental agency, alleging that their universities are actually breaking law by investing in fossil fuels. This is an argument that comes out of some very cool legal scholarship and also is grounded in a very specific law, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, which is specific to nonprofit institutions. But a lot of the arguments about fiduciary duty, right, and fiduciary duty requiring fossil fuel divestment that have been put forward in these complaints could well be applicable to work that one might do around pension funds, around divesting non-university, nonprofit institutions, and potentially even for-profit institutions who are not bound by any sort of nonprofit law either. So if there's a tiny URL link to a guide that we put together at Divest Harvard and Boston College about how one can file a legal complaint of this kind, and it walks folks through step by step the legal rationale for such complaints, how fiduciary duty relates to fossil fuel divestment, and so on. So I highly recommend taking a look at it. It may give you a lot of real even to present a case for fossil fuel investment if you don't necessarily want to take up this tactic. But again, this is a tactic also you might want to take up, particularly, if you're part of a campaign looking to divest your alma mater and your alma mater is intransigent as Harvard or any of the other schools where complaints were filed is. This is a great way to really put your institution on notice. And also it has nationwide implications. If any single complaint moves forward, that could impact the way that all of the others are seen as well. And again, this is also just a public accountability measure for universities, right? Really shines a spotlight on their continued refusal to get with the program when it comes to a just transition. Can we go to the slide? So these are a few ways you could get involved divestment. Your pension fund, divesting your bank account, your alma mater. There are a lot of go from it's it's line 3 pipeline right now. And also some great networks like Stop the Money Pipeline, Divest Ed, College Climate Coalition that you might turn to for further resources and ideas. Go to the next one. Slide just breaks down sort of how you can find out whether or not a specific fund you are interested in divesting has made any sort of divestment commitment yet. Some funds made, partial commitments or weaker commitments, like they're only divesting from coal, or they're not divesting from gas yet. And those are things you should look at as well, because you may well want to push something that has some level of commitment further and use that first commitment as an inroad. And then on the second half of this slide, there's a list of resources you can utilize to just start connecting with folks who are already in the divestment space, whether that's a broader space or one specific to the fund you're looking at. Okay, I talked a lot. Hopefully some of it was helpful. And we have time for some questions.
Thank you, Ilana. Ted, would you like to moderate the Q&A?
Sure. Though I don't have a lot of people on my screen, it's a relatively small screen, so I could have some trouble seeing people who've got questions or hands raised. You can put questions in the chat if you'd like. That's always an option. Larry?
I want to thank you, Ilana. I have been a part of the Harvard alum network that has been working for years and years and years and years on this. I just want to underline, sometimes it takes a long time to to move these issues. I also have been working with the Williams College, my undergraduate college, and with the same lack of success and intransigence from the administration. So folks need to recognize that that can happen. At the same token, I really want to underline, I want to say two things. One, I want to encourage everybody to not only to work on their own portfolios. There are lots of fossil fuel free portfolio and organizations available that you can put your money with. The other thing is that I want to encourage you to check out your own alma maters, because they're almost always alumni organizations, and you can align yourself with those and just get your shoulder to that wheel. So I think that's the other thing I wanted to mention, and thank you for, Ilana, is making the point that this is not simply about divesting. It's also reinvesting in clean energy equities and investments. So it's more a matter of portfolio transformation than it is simply divestment, and that's just something to bear in mind.
While people are thinking of their questions, Ilana, if you could give us an example or two of a particularly outstanding way to reinvest, examples you know of, things that have actually happened.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, my Wi-Fi cut out. I think it was 2 examples of reinvestments that have happened. Is that the question? Okay, yes. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of great examples off the top of mind, which is part of the problem. And that's like a rushing of 2 things. One, the divestment campaigns historically have not been as focused on reinvestment. And this really started changing with, I guess, it would be the second or third wave of us folks who came in around 2018. I think with a mindset that was just more oriented as a result of our experiences and public consciousness towards environmental justice being really central. But 2, like these funds scaling up seriously as the divestment movement has been successful. So that's the other part of it. There are definitely universities like Cambridge is a good example that have made concerted commitments to investing in clean energy solutions in addition to divesting from fossil fuels. That's very common. It's not ever a scale, right? Or I haven't seen it of like the whole endowment. And to some extent that might be hard given the scale of like, alternative funds that exist for that purpose, not just fossil fuel free funds, but proactively just and renewable funds. But certainly those funds exist. Like there's one in Boston. There's a great collective called the Boston Ujima Project, whose whole goal is sort of like scaling up just and sustainable industries. And I mean, for a place like Harvard, for example, to put any amount of money into that would be truly, it could be transformative, incredible, right? So part of it is really pushing institutions to think more critically about how they're using their funds overall and aligning them with their espoused principles. They truly believe in, a future beyond climate injustice and climate chaos. That means more than just not investing in fossil fuels. And to some extent, it really means more than just investing in like the most obvious big scale clean energy solutions. Though those sorts of investments are great and we are asking for them too.
George.
But definitely, I'll say, sorry, quickly before Tricia, there are definitely personal routes that are much more intuitive. Like if you divest your bank account, there are a lot of banks that like very specifically invest in climate justice oriented funds. Like Amalgamated Bank is a good example of that.
George.
Yes, Ilana. One of the questions that my wife and I have been grappling with is there's a fund with the symbol VOTE, and it's done by a company called Engine Number One, whose purpose is to actually invest in large companies and force changes of the board of directors and other changes like that to reform those companies. I'm curious about your opinion of that approach.
Yeah, that's a hard and very good question. I think what the engine number one folks are doing is very admirable, very important. It's definitely a different degree of change. I think the reality is that that was amazing success, but it would take so long to do that at a scale at which it could truly transform the business models of any single one of these major fossil fuel companies. I'm not quite convinced it's like the route to go. I think the reality is that, a lot of major fossil fuel companies have made it abundantly clear that they have no plans to really align with a just energy transition on a meaningful timeline. They do that over and over again. And also they very clearly design their decision-making processes and their governmental structures so as to keep people like those folks out. And the fact that engine number one could break through is amazing, but I'm not convinced that it's more than sort of like a wonderful amount of success, or that it could seriously change the reality of what a company like ExxonMobil is. So that's not to put down what they're doing. Again, I think it's amazing, but I think more broadly, it's the timeline we're working on sort of creates a clear imperative to stop these companies from having the kinds of political successes that they're having, and also really build up alternatives. Again, I'm not sure, no matter how many directors change at ExxonMobil, that it's a company at this point I trust with my future, with the lives and livelihoods of any other folks on this planet. And shareholder engagement more broadly, is a strategy that just at level makes sense when it comes to fossil fuel companies. Their core model of business is fossil fuel production and extraction. It is like the exploitation and extraction of natural resources and also the most vulnerable communities. So it's like asking them to change their core model of business is a very, very hard ask, and one, again, that they've shown clear resistance to, as opposed to, applying shareholder engagement with a company like Apple per se, where you might be advocating for them to have better labor practices. Having better labor practices isn't sort of implicating their core business model of producing iPhones and Macs or whatever. So that's a place where shareholder engagement, in my mind, might make a lot of sense. But not when it comes to asking Apple not to make iPhones anymore. That seems like a really hard thing to do, no matter how much change you try to over time there.
If we could squeeze in one more question before you have to skip off to class. John Elder would like to know, and all of us would like to know, what the primary arguments are usually given by institutions for not divesting. And I'd like to tag that with, how do you get around rationales for not divesting that include, we have a fiduciary responsibility to max out our profits, or we contribute to addressing climate change by the research our faculty does. How do you get around those arguments?
Super great question. I'll also say, when the slides are sent around, I put a bunch of resources at the end, and one is specifically about debunking divestment myths, so common are pulled up by fund managers. But yeah, I would say, in terms of the last thing that, we have faculty or we have folks who are doing other climate work, I think just really stressing that there's this clear hypocrisy in continuing to actively invest in the existence of companies that are driving the climate crisis, while also, trying to show in other ways a commitment to sustainability is something to highlight. Really, if you are committed to having faculty do research on climate solutions, if you're committed to decarbonizing your campus or whatever the physical infrastructure is of a fund, then it's only intuitive and natural that you should be aligning your financial practice with the principles you're trying to practice on these other scales, right? There's fundamentally complementary tactics. And also, having fossil, I think there's another question at alma maters, which is about taking fossil research and things. And, regardless of whatever that research looks like, that's another way of lending a social license and credibility to the fossil fuel industry and to the model of business it's perpetuating. Another common trope I've heard is like, we can't politicize the endowment or whatever fund it is. Divestment is as political as investment. I think that's the clear response to that. And I will say, like, I think a big argument over the earlier in this decade was that divesting from fossil fuels would have financial risks or potentially abrogate fiduciary duty. That's just so clearly not true at this point in time. There's overwhelming evidence that points to the reality that divestment could have no financial impact at all on the fund, but also that it could have financial impact on the funds. And that's now recognized by major asset managers like BlackRock and McKenna. So the evidence for that is there. The evidence that, renewable energy investments can be very lucrative is also there. And again, the arguments that fiduciary duty is not only not violated by fossil fuel divestment, but might actually require fossil fuel divestment are quite robust at this point in time.
All right, friends, we could listen to Ilana all day and we could pelt her with questions all day.